Britain had its highwaymen and America its outlaws, but Australian counterparts became known as Bushrangers. The term first appeared in print early in the 1800s to refer to robbers and murderers who melted into the bush between their various crimes. Then, poor communication and sparse settlement often meant they could roam the bush, hold up travellers, raid homesteads, towns and banks, and disappear before news of their activity spread. Possibly up to 2,000 bushrangers roamed the Australian bush, mostly during the 1800s. But I plan to touch on only a few, state by state, although some borders did not exist then and borders did not constrain their activities. I don't aim to glorify criminals of the past, but many escaped convicts had few options for survival other than bushranging. Transportation to the eastern states ended during the 1830s, so until the middle of the century, bushrangers were mostly escapees. For the following 15 years, with few convicts remaining to escape, and the discovery of gold, a new style of bushranger emerged, mostly from free settlers. A brief, not so desperate third wave occurred in the early 1900s. Until 1825, Tasmania was still part of New South Wales, and from 1804 to 1853, more than 70,000 convicts were transported to the island, then called Van Diemen's Land. Many were assigned to work as servants in coal mines or timber cutting. They were often at the mercy of their overseer, and lashing was a common punishment. During a time when supply ships failed to arrive, rations were cut severely, and convicts were sent into the bush to hunt for food. The temptation to not return must have been great. Over time, around 400 convicts escaped and were referred to as bolters. Some perished in the bush, others survived as bushrangers, and a few were eaten by starving fellow escapees. Army deserters and ship jumpers, unable to work legally, often took to bushranging to survive. When Mosquito, a Daruk Aboriginal, was shunned by his tribe on the Hawkesbury in 1805, he began violent raids on farms near Sydney. After colonists held a group of his people hostage, he was captured and exiled to the notorious Norfolk Island to work as a lime burner. Later transferred to Van Diemen's Land, he worked as an Aboriginal tracker and joined a mob of displaced Aborigines. They lived peacefully until one of their women was shot by a colonist, leading to ongoing retaliation. In 1824, Mosquito was shot, captured and later tried. As a non-Christian, he could not give sworn evidence to rebut some of the doubtful testimony and was found guilty and hanged. Hobart was barely more than a camp in 1815 when Lieutenant Governor Thomas Davey declared martial law, as, with few resources and without a court, he had no means of punishing bushrangers in Tasmania. One of the worst was Michael Howe, an English Navy and Army deserter who escaped after being transported for highway robbery. He called himself Governor of the Woods and led a gang of up to 100 followers, including an Aboriginal girl called Mary Cockerell, who became his lover, and is among a handful of known female bushrangers. Although he was in and out of captivity a number of times, he controlled so much of the island that influential Midland squatters found it prudent to support him. Davey was poorly regarded, so in 1817 was replaced by William Sorrell, who wasted no time offering a reward for Howe. To aid his escape from soldiers, Howe wounded Mary. Incensed by this, she later helped police, assisted by Mosquito working as a tracker, to locate an inebriated Howe. He was clubbed to death and his decapitated head was displayed in Hobart. Mary died a year later of lung infection, aged 20. 20-year-old Irishman Martin Cash was transported to Sydney in 1828 after shooting and wounding a man grappling with his lady friend. After 3 years on a chain gang, he served the rest of his sentence assigned to a farm on the Hunter. When freed, he married, but was later unknowingly involved with branding some stolen cattle, so jumped on a ship to Van Diemen's Land. It didn't take long before he found himself in Port Arthur. Between numerous escapes from there and Norfolk Island, he managed to shoot a policeman. With two others, Cash escaped a work party and was in shootouts with police at the Woolpack Inn at Gretna and Halfway House in Antill Ponds, before being captured in another shootout in Hobart. A commuted death sentence allowed him to serve more time on Norfolk Island. After receiving his ticket of leave, he worked as a milliner, then a constable, married again at 46 in 1854, and became overseer of Hobart Botanical Gardens. He died in his bed at Cash Cottage, aged 69. In 1839, a group of around 15 Aboriginals were taken from Tasmania to the west of Port Phillip Bay on the mainland to act as servants for the protector of Aboriginals. But they were soon abandoned there. Amongst them was Truganini, a young woman whose traditional life had earlier been severely impacted by the arrival of white foreigners, but who would live to become one of the last speakers of Tasmanian Indigenous language. Through a series of unfortunate events, she and 4 others killed 2 whalers. Declared as outlaws, they raided huts in the district, taking food and guns, before being captured by a posse of about 30. The public hanging of the 2 men was the first legal execution in Melbourne, but the 3 women were freed and eventually taken back to Tasmania, where Truganini continued her resistance to white occupation. In 1851, Victoria officially separated from New South Wales. Gold was found in both colonies, attracting hundreds of thousands of new migrants from around the world to the goldfields. But life was tough there, and callous bureaucracy made it tougher, resulting in the Eureka Stockade Rebellion 3 years later. The population increase meant rural areas became severely under-policed, with police often poorly equipped and operating in arduous conditions. All this provided excellent opportunities for bushrangers. Undoubtedly the most infamous Victorian bushranger was Ned Kelly, whose gang included his brother Dan and friends. Their story is well known, so this is a brief version. His Irish father had been transported for stealing pigs, and later settled near Avenel. At 11, Ned rescued a young neighbour from drowning, but a year later his father died and the rest of the family moved to Glenrowan. From age 14, Ned served stretchers in custody for various offences. During an 1878 attempt to arrest Dan at their mother's house on 11 Mile Creek, Trooper Fitzpatrick was wounded. Ned made the trooper extract the bullet from his own wrist before he was set free. The 2 brothers scarpered into the bush, but their mother served 3 years for her part in the incident. The gang later killed 3 police sent to arrest them, so a reward was offered, dead or alive. During their time on the run, they were involved in many incidents and robbed banks at Euroa and Jerilderie, but in 1880 returned to Glenrowan and hammered ploughshares into armour, intending to storm the police station. The plan failed and the gang came under siege in the local inn. During an extended shootout, Ned suffered 28 wounds before being captured. Other members were killed, although some suggest Dan escaped and many years later was buried in Ipswich, Queensland. After his recovery, Ned was tried in Melbourne and hanged. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in Pentridge Jail and later moved to an unmarked site near other family members at Greta. In 1978, his skull disappeared from a display case at Pentridge. Recently was thought to be returned from Western Australia, but the DNA doesn't match. A mentor for the 14-year-old Ned Kelly had been Harry Power, born Henry Johnson, and transported from Ireland to Tasmania in 1840 for stealing a pair of shoes. After gaining freedom, he moved to Victoria and began stealing horses in 1848, leading to time on a prison halt at Williamtown. Later, he was in and out of jail numerous times for horse stealing and robbery, with a young Ned Kelly assisting with some of his escapes. A reward of £500 led to his final arrest in 1870 at a lookout above King Valley that bears his name. Power later suggested information from Kelly may have aided his capture. Ill health saw him released from Pentridge 7 years later, and in 1891 he briefly became a museum guide on the prison hulk that had once been his jail. He was later found drowned in the Murray River near Swan Hill. Another bushranger of Irish stock, made famous in a rebellious anthem, The Wild Colonial Boy, was Jack Doolan, although verses may include some exploits of Jack Donohoe in New South Wales. His homeland even has a statue of a wild colonial boy. In 1869, after 12-year-old Doolan stabbed a fellow apprentice, he spent a year in a prison hulk off Fisherman's Bend, where he met his future partner in crime, Edward Donnelly, convicted of horse stealing. After release, they bushranged together and with others before Jack was caught and jailed to serve a sentence many thought too severe. After release 10 years later, he does not appear on any further records. 18-year-old Thomas Maynard, or Yankee Tom, arrived in Victoria from Louisiana in 1855 seeking gold. 10 years later, while working as a labourer, he fatally stabbed a fellow worker and went bush soon after. While on the run, he committed robberies and possibly more murders before being arrested, tried and hanged later that year, although the hanging was botched and he maintained a pulse for 15 minutes. In February 1859, near Port Fairy, a single police officer attempted to arrest two men suspected of assault and highway robbery. One was fatally shot after aiming a gun at the constable. Subsequently, the other was tried in Portland and jailed after being found guilty of assault and highway robbery. Stolen property was found on the property of the dead man, who was later buried in Port Fairy, but his identity remained a mystery, as his partner in crime knew him only as Dick. Possibly from Philadelphia, Black Douglas, perhaps really Charles Russell, worked as a labourer in England until transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1835 for stealing 2 coats. Described as a mulatto Indian, he may have received up to 1,000 lashes during the next 6 years, possibly prompting his escape. His real notoriety resulted from bushranging on the Victorian goldfields. For the rest of his life, he was in and out of prison frequently for various, mostly minor crimes, although he did serve time in solitary. During time outside, he found fame as a prize fighter. In 1895, he was captured after angry minders burned and razed his camp. Despite calls for his lynching, he was handed to police and served time again. He died at 75 in Bendigo jail while serving 3 months for vagrancy. A £1,000 reward was offered for Mad Dog Daniel Morgan after he killed a police sergeant in 1864. This was the most enduring of many aliases for a bushranger who was born John Owen at Appin in New South Wales. The epithet Mad Dog, although appropriate, does not seem to have been used during his lifetime and may have been applied later to spice up a film. Before he turned 20, he had achieved a reputation in the Mallee as a horse thief and been shot in the leg during a chase. An 1854 sentence of 12 years hard labour for highway robbery included time on the same prison hulk as Harry Power. After release, he carried out many hold-ups over southern New South Wales and Victoria, often targeting squatters. As retribution for what he considered informing, he burned a squatter's woolshed and the clip to the ground. Instances of torture were reported, and he killed 2 police sergeants in separate incidents. 40 kilometres north of Albury, a lookout now bears his name, and nearby Walla Walla Station was the scene of a protracted siege where he fatally wounded a station overseer. As an expert bushman and horseman, he continued to range across 2 states and evade capture until, aged 34, he was shot and killed by a stockman after holding up Peach Elba Station. At the time, Christina McPherson was a child at the station, and she would later play a tune for Banjo Patterson, to which he set the words for Waltzing Matilda. Sometime prior to Morgan's burial at Wangaratta, In a barbarous act, his luxuriant beard was removed by hacking away the lower part of his face. His head may have been sent to an anatomy professor in Melbourne, and the rest of him was buried at Wangaratta. Publican John Watt was shot dead during the hold-up of his hotel at Wurrigi. 3 men were involved, but one turned Queen's evidence, which resulted in James Smith and Thomas Brady being found guilty of murder and hanged in 1873. In 1922, newspapers described 15-year-old Henry Maple as a boy bushranger after he was mortally wounded near Neerim when a posse tried to arrest him and he attempted to return fire. He was on the run, believing he had shot a policeman during an earlier altercation. Possibly he was the most unlucky of a number of boy bushrangers in the early 1900s who attempted to emulate earlier bushrangers. Most were captured alive after committing armed robberies.